after the United States banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808. The nation's economic engine quietly shifted in a disturbing direction, one that turned human reproduction into a calculated strategy for wealth. Instead of relying on ships crossing the Atlantic, powerful landowners looked inward, manipulating families, futures, and generations to sustain the labor force that fueled America's growing economy. This hidden system expanded quietly, often unmentioned in textbooks and softened in public memory. Yet it played a defining role in shaping the social and economic landscape of the early 19th century. The story you are about to hear is not just a historical footnote, it is a truth deliberately pushed into the shadows, behind the familiar narratives of fields, plantations, and labor lies a deeper machinery of control, where lives were tracked, decisions were made for them, and entire communities were shaped by forces far beyond their reach. Understanding this history helps us recognize the resilience of those who endured it, and the importance of acknowledging every chapter of the past, even the ones that challenge our comfort. If this journey into hidden history matters to you, if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring overlooked stories to light and ensures that more people can learn from the past with honesty and clarity. Thank you for being here, and let us continue uncovering the truths that shaped our world. As the demand for labor intensified across the Deep South, a new and deeply unsettling reality began to take shape in the regions of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina. These areas, once defined by declining crops and shifting agricultural priorities, quietly transformed into hubs supplying people to the rapidly expanding cotton and sugar frontiers. What unfolded there was not visible in public speeches or official records. It lived instead in the quiet decisions made within plantation houses, in the ledgers that tracked lives with the precision of inventory, and in the unspoken rules that governed countless households. Families who had lived for generations in one region found themselves confronted with forces far larger than themselves. Forces that reshaped their futures in ways they could neither predict nor control. Women, especially, stood at the center of this hidden system. Their daily lives were intertwined with expectations and pressures that went far beyond labor in the fields or work within the home. Their bodies became intertwined with the economic calculations of others, and the course of their lives shifted as those in power sought new ways to sustain the growing labor needs of distant plantations. In many cases, they had no say in the direction their lives took, yet they carried the weight of decisions they never made. The moment the nation closed its ports to international trafficking, the attention of many landowners turned inward, treating the creation of new generations not as a natural progression of family and community, but as a means to respond to economic opportunity hundreds of miles away. The stories that emerged from this period reflect not only hardship but an extraordinary depth of endurance. Women navigated a world where their futures were often mapped out without their knowledge, where the families they formed could be uprooted with little warning, and where the arrival of a new child brought emotions that were far more complicated than the simple joy that should accompany new life. Across the Upper South, the rhythm of daily life became entangled with the needs of distant markets, creating a chain of events that carried people from their homes to places they had never seen, sometimes never to return. Communities felt the impact as well. Entire groups slowly thinned as individuals were taken away, leaving behind gaps that could not be easily filled. People who once worked side by side found themselves separated with little explanation, connected only by memories and hopes that one day paths might cross again. In some households, the sound of footsteps on the porch or the approach of a messenger brought a quiet, unspoken fear that someone would be taken away. Despite this constant uncertainty, people still created bonds, shared moments of laughter, maintained traditions, and supported one another in ways that kept their sense of identity alive, even when the world around them felt unstable. Meanwhile, The Deep South continued to expand at a remarkable pace. Cotton industries flourished as new lands were cleared, and sugar plantations grew into vast operations requiring an enormous workforce. As the distance between the Upper South and the Deep South widened economically, a quiet pipeline formed, moving people from the older regions to the booming agricultural centers along the Gulf. Each journey southward marked a shift not only in geography but in the lives and futures of those involved. And through it all, the women whose stories anchored this system carried with them memories of home, hopes for their children, and the strength to continue shaping their lives even when circumstances tried to shape them first. The principle known as Pater Secutor Ventrum, quietly woven into the laws of the American colonies and later the young United States, became one of the most powerful forces shaping the lives of families who were struggling to hold on to their humanity under an oppressive system. It declared that a child's status followed that of the mother, which meant that no matter who the father was, no matter what circumstances surrounded a birth, the child's life was predetermined from the moment they opened their eyes. This rule was not simply a line in a statute book. It was a mechanism that ensured entire generations remained bound, and it allowed those who controlled the system to project their power far into the future. As the story unfolds across the regions where this doctrine took deepest root, it becomes clear how it reshaped communities and created an unbroken chain linking one generation to the next, all justified under the veneer of legality that made exploitation appear orderly and legitimate. Families living under these conditions carried a profound understanding of how this rule shaped their daily reality. Mothers knew from the moment they felt the first signs of life within them that their children's futures had been claimed before birth. Many found themselves navigating a quiet, painful calculus, trying to protect the next generation in whatever ways were available to them. Some passed down coded knowledge about staying together. Others preserved stories and names that kept lineages alive even when people were separated, because they understood that identity was one of the few things that oppressive systems could not fully erase. Within these communities, elders repeated stories of strength, not just to remember the past, but to resist the erasure embedded in legal structures that tried to reduce them to numbers in a ledger. This doctrine spread through the coastal regions of the Mid-Atlantic and the South, and as the decades passed, it shaped the economies of places that depended heavily on the labor extracted from these communities. The rule encouraged those in positions of authority to see future generations not as individuals, but as projections of productivity, something they calculated into contracts, inheritances, and long-term plans for expanding their estates. Yet while these calculations were being made in offices and courthouse halls, the people living with the consequences forged their own ways of understanding time, hope, and belonging. Many grandparents became the quiet historians of their families, passing down what they knew so their descendants could one day piece together full identities that the legal system worked so hard to fracture. Inside this world, children grew up hearing their elders whisper about ancestors who kept traditions alive despite relentless pressure to forget. And through those stories they learned that they carried more than the labels imposed on them. They inherited knowledge, resilience, and creativity, all of which helped them build small pockets of stability, even in places designed to offer none. As boys and girls grew older, they saw how their parents and grandparents negotiated daily life within an environment where lineage had been turned into a mechanism of control. And yet they also witnessed how families reinterpreted lineage as a source of strength that allowed them to persist through the most difficult circumstances. Over time, the meaning of Pater Secutor Ventrum evolved beyond the legal world that first conceived it. It became a symbol of how systems can attempt to regulate identity and future generations, and also of how communities respond to such pressures with determination stronger than the forces working against them. The legacy of this doctrine can be traced through countless personal histories. many of which reveal not only the hardships people endured but also the ways they carved pathways toward dignity and continuity. Each family that survived under its shadow helped create the foundations for future movements that would challenge the very structures this rule was built to protect, showing that even the most entrenched systems can be confronted when the stories of those affected are preserved, remembered, and eventually brought into the light. Within the world shaped by generational constraints and laws designed to mold the lives of entire families, another deeply troubling reality unfolded, one that revealed how knowledge, authority, and the pursuit of scientific advancement could be intertwined with the vulnerabilities of people who had no power to protect themselves. As the story moves forward, it becomes impossible to ignore how certain physicians of the era built their reputations by treating human beings not as patients, deserving care and dignity, but as subjects whose lack of legal protection left them exposed to procedures they did not choose, understand, or have the ability to refuse. Among the most widely discussed figures connected to this history was G. Marion Sims, whose early surgical experiments relied on the bodies of women who endured repeated procedures without pain relief, all under the belief that their experiences could drive medical progress. This part of the narrative reveals another dimension of how systems of control reached far beyond labor and inheritance, extending into the realm of health and bodily autonomy. The women involved in these procedures lived within communities already carrying the weight of generational hardship. And even in the midst of these challenges, they held onto pieces of themselves that the system could never fully claim. Their names, though not always preserved in official records, lived on in the memories passed quietly among families, a testament to their endurance. These women were more than participants in a chapter later studied in medical history. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and individuals with their own hopes and inner landscapes. The circumstances they faced were shaped by a world in which the law provided few protections, allowing those in positions of authority to make decisions without considering the personal cost to the people whose lives were altered by those choices. Inside the communities where these women came from, stories circulated about strength under impossible conditions. Elders spoke about how these individuals carried not just physical burdens but emotional and spiritual ones as well, and how they navigated each day with a resilience that younger generations later looked to for guidance. This resilience formed a thread connecting them to others who also confronted situations where their bodies were seen as resources rather than as integral parts of identities, families, and futures. As the years passed, these stories contributed to a deeper understanding of what it meant to survive in an environment where even the most intimate aspects of life could be shaped by forces outside one's control. The physicians who performed these procedures often framed their work as contributions to growing fields of science and medicine, and at the time, the wider society largely accepted this reasoning. Yet the communities who lived with the consequences understood the situation differently. For them, it was a reminder that power could manifest not only in laws and labor demands, but also in decisions made in clinics, hospitals, and makeshift surgical rooms. These experiences shaped how families viewed health, trust, and their body's relationship to the world around them. And this connection persisted long after the procedures themselves had ended. Looking back, the legacy of these events reveals a complex story of scientific advancement intertwined with ethical questions that continue to spark discussion. The women who endured these procedures became symbolic of broader struggles faced by people who lived within a system that attempted to dictate every aspect of their existence. Their stories also highlight how communities managed to preserve a sense of identity despite constant attempts to redefine them. The endurance of these individuals, and the ways their experiences were later reclaimed by historians, community leaders, and descendants, demonstrate how the past continues to influence conversations about consent, equity, and the responsibility that comes with pursuing knowledge. Through their stories, the narrative gains a deeper understanding of how people confronted challenges that reached far beyond their daily routines, shaping a legacy that remains vital to understanding this complex chapter of history. As the story continues through the intertwined worlds of generational constraints, forced labor, and medical exploitation, another profound reality emerges, one that shaped not just individuals but the emotional core of entire communities. Even as people endured the daily pressures of a system that claimed control over their work, bodies, and futures, one of the deepest wounds came from the constant threat of separation. The internal trade that expanded across the nation after the early 19th century became a force that reshaped the landscape of countless families, moving people not across oceans but across vast distances within the same country. This movement was not a journey of choice, but one imposed by markets that treated human lives as part of an economic strategy. And it created a pattern of loss that defined the experiences of many who lived during this time. Families that had built their own rhythms, small traditions, and ways of caring for one another always carried the quiet fear that a single decision made far from their influence could tear them apart. Parents tucked their children in at night wondering whether they would be allowed to wake up under the same roof. Brothers and sisters formed bonds strengthened by the knowledge that time together might be limited, and couples found themselves planning futures with an understanding that those futures could change without warning. In many communities, elders told stories of loved ones who were moved to distant regions, remembering birthdays, smiles, and voices long after the people themselves had been taken away. These separations created emotional scars that shaped the identity of the communities, influencing how they grieved, hoped, and held on to memories. When large groups were transported from one region to another, the scenes along the roadways or river routes became reminders of how widespread this movement had become. Travelers described lines of people walking through unfamiliar landscapes, often silent, often surrounded by individuals who shared their fate but not their family ties. Along these routes, bonds formed between strangers who recognized in each other the same sense of dislocation. Their shared experiences created new forms of connection, offering moments of comfort during an otherwise overwhelming journey. Yet even within these emergent communities, the longing for familiar faces, familiar laughter, and the comfort of home remained ever present. For those who stayed behind, life became a mixture of resilience and waiting. People continued to support one another, creating networks that softened the blow of loss even if they could not prevent it. In the evenings, families gathered to speak the names of those taken, keeping their memory alive. Sometimes news would travel through travelers or traders, offering a small fragment of reassurance, a name recognized, a place identified, a detail that indicated a loved one was still alive somewhere far away. These fragments were treasured, carried like small lights through the uncertainty of each passing year. Despite the hardship, communities managed to maintain a sense of identity, weaving stories of love, survival, and connection into their daily lives. Even when separated, many people held on to the belief that their relationships remained meaningful across distance. Songs emerged from this hope, telling stories of reunion, of journeys made in dreams, of voices calling across rivers and forests. These songs were passed down through generations, offering comfort long after the original singers were gone. The scale of this forced movement reveals how deeply the system reached into personal lives. More than 1 million people experienced the upheaval, and nearly half of the community lived with the pain of separation from close family members. Yet even within this devastating reality, the strength of human connection persisted. Families adapted, hoped, remembered, and rebuilt. leaving behind a legacy that continues to inform how we understand resilience, identity, and the enduring power of the bonds people create with one another. As the narrative unfolds through generations shaped by control, separation, and the constant negotiation of identity under forces far beyond their choosing, another layer becomes clear, one that speaks not only to the past itself, but also to how the past has been remembered, taught, and framed for future generations. The events that shaped the lives of so many were not only lived, but also later filtered through a lens that often softened or erased the most uncomfortable truths. Over time, the stories of controlled reproduction, forced movement, and the profound reshaping of families were gradually pushed to the margins of public memory, hidden behind broader narratives that emphasized economic growth or national progress, while leaving out the human realities that made such growth possible. As communities passed their stories down through personal memory, official institutions developed their own versions of the past, placing certain events at the forefront while leaving others to fade quietly. Textbooks written decades after these events often focused on political debates, regional tensions, and legislative milestones, yet offered only a brief mention, if any, of the systems that shaped everyday life for so many, the emotional landscapes of families who endured separation, the profound effects of generational constraints, and the experiences of women whose lives were shaped by pressures they could not refuse rarely appeared in formal accounts. Instead, these narratives survived in private conversations, songs, and quiet recollections shared in homes, gatherings, and community spaces, far removed from classrooms or public monuments. This selective memory influenced how society understood its own development. The absence of certain details gave the impression of a past that was difficult but not deeply shaped by policies and practices that affected millions of lives. Without the stories of how people navigated the challenges placed upon them, the public understanding of endurance, hope, and survival became incomplete. The full weight of these experiences, including the economic strategies that relied on controlling reproduction and movement, was softened in ways that allowed the nation to present itself as progressing steadily toward ideals it had not always upheld. Yet within the communities directly affected, memory did not fade in the same way. Families preserved stories as a form of truth-telling, passing down names, events, and teachings through generations. These accounts became a foundation for understanding not just the past, but the resilience that carried people through the most difficult circumstances. They spoke of individuals who held on to dignity despite efforts to undermine it, who maintained bonds across distances, and who found ways to protect one another emotionally even when separated physically. These memories offered a sense of continuity that formal narratives often lacked. As the years moved forward, historians, writers, and community leaders began working to bring these overlooked stories into broader conversations. They recognized that without acknowledging the full complexity of the past, including the parts that had been intentionally minimized, it would be impossible to understand the depth of the challenges people faced or the strength they carried through them. Their efforts revealed how strategic silence had shaped public perception for generations, and how reclaiming these stories allowed communities to better understand themselves and the paths that led to the present. This process of uncovering and reintroducing hidden history has become a vital part of preserving collective memory. It expands the narrative beyond official records, allowing the experiences of families and individuals to take their rightful place in the broader story. Through this restoration of memory, the narrative gains a clearer view of the endurance that defined so many lives, revealing not only the hardships they faced but also the unbroken determination that carried them forward. As the story deepens, moving through the realities of generational constraints, family separations, hidden narratives, and the experiences of those whose lives unfolded within systems they did not choose, Another layer of record-keeping reveals how thoroughly everyday existence was shaped by calculations and documentation. Within many large estates, meticulous books were kept, ledgers that charted births, ages, family connections, and physical characteristics in a manner far removed from the way families themselves understood and valued their relationships. These records did not reflect moments of joy or the milestones families celebrated in private. Instead, they were compiled to measure growth, productivity, and future labor in a system where economic strategy often overshadowed human connection. The numbers, dates, and brief notes written into these books formed a stark contrast to the rich emotional worlds of the individuals whose lives were reduced to entries on a page. For the women at the center of these records, daily life carried a complexity that extended far beyond the lines in the ledger. They were nurturing children, forming bonds, creating routines, and supporting one another through the difficulties they encountered, all while living with the knowledge that outside forces tracked the smallest details of their family lives. Mothers watched their children take their first steps, listened to their early words, and comforted them in moments of fear or uncertainty, even as they understood that decisions far beyond their control could shape what came next. These moments of tenderness were cherished within communities, becoming anchors in a world where official documentation focused not on memories or milestones, but on potential outcomes and future expectations. Within the pages of these books, children appeared as numbers, marked down at birth and updated as they grew. Families, however, saw them as the center of their hopes, carrying traditions, stories, and the quiet strength passed down from one generation to the next. Elders often spoke about how important it was to preserve identity, even when facing circumstances that tried to define it from the outside. They believed that names, songs, and shared stories could offer roots stronger than any ledger. This belief shaped how families supported each other, finding ways to maintain emotional unity in a world where structural forces often worked against them. Those who maintained the ledgers viewed the information as essential for planning, yet the people whose lives filled the pages saw them as symbols of how deeply the system reached into their most personal experiences. Even so, individuals and families carved out spaces where they could define themselves on their own terms. In the evenings, after the work of the day was done, stories were told, lullabies were sung, and quiet rituals were performed, rituals that affirmed identity and belonging in ways no written record could capture. These moments became the threads that held families together, providing a sense of continuity that ledger books could never offer. Over time, some of these ledgers survived and became historical records, offering modern readers a glimpse into the structured systems that influenced so many lives. Yet the real history lies not in the cold columns of numbers, but in the resilience of the people behind them. Their lived experiences reveal a world where individuals created meaning despite restrictions, where families held on to each other through uncertainty, and where memory was preserved in ways that official documentation could never replicate. As part of the broader narrative, these records underscore how deeply controlled environments attempted to shape the future, while the people living within them quietly built legacies defined by strength, endurance, and the unbreakable bonds that connected them across generations, within the world shaped by generational rules, hidden narratives, and the careful record-keeping that reduced lives to lines in ledger books. Another dimension of control unfolded, one that affected not only women and families, but also the men whose identities were reshaped by expectations they never chose. Within certain estates, decisions were made not only about labor and movement, but also about which individuals would be paired together, based on the belief that physical characteristics could be managed in the same way other aspects of the workforce were managed. These choices were driven by economic calculation rather than personal connection, and they imposed a heavy burden on the men involved, whose daily lives were already marked by pressures that left little room for self-determination. Many of these men entered adulthood with dreams and emotions shaped by their own families. Friendships and relationships formed in their communities. They learned skills, shared stories with elders, and supported younger members of their households, building bonds that helped them navigate each day. Yet within the structured environments of certain estates, their identities were sometimes recast in ways that ignored these human connections. Decisions about pairing were made with an eye toward the future, guided by assumptions about strength, endurance, or height, traits recorded in the same books that tracked births, ages, and productivity. These choices created a world where natural relationships were frequently disrupted, and where the men involved carried emotional weight rarely acknowledged in official records. In the communities where these men lived, however, the story was understood differently. Friends and family recognized the quiet struggles that accompanied expectations placed upon them, acknowledging how deeply such demands could affect the spirit. Conversations held in the evenings, after the day's work had ended and the world grew quieter, reflected empathy and understanding. People supported one another through shared experiences, offering reassurance that identity could not be reduced to the roles imposed upon them. These private spaces became sanctuaries where men could reclaim the parts of themselves that systems of control tried to redefine. The emotional consequences of these imposed decisions extended far beyond individual experiences. Families felt the ripple effects as natural relationships were interrupted, futures were reshaped, and people navigated circumstances that offered little room for choice. Yet even within these constraints, communities held on to traditions that affirmed their humanity. They sang songs that spoke of belonging, told stories of ancestors who embodied courage, and passed down wisdom that reminded each generation of their inherent worth. These cultural practices became acts of quiet resistance, reinforcing the belief that identity was rooted in more than the demands placed upon them. As time passed, the men whose lives were shaped by these expectations continued to contribute to the emotional and cultural foundations of their communities. They became sources of guidance for the younger generation, sharing lessons learned through hardship and encouraging perseverance. Their resilience offered a contrast to the impersonal calculations found in ledgers, showing that human character could never be fully captured in numbers or notes. Their presence strengthened families, supported friendships, and helped preserve a sense of connection even in environments designed to limit personal agency. When historians later studied this era, many discovered that the official records offered only a fragment of the truth. The deeper story lived in the memories passed down through families, the whispered recollections of grandparents, the songs that survived across decades, and the stories told at gatherings where the past was honored with care and respect. These memories revealed how individuals navigated circumstances shaped by forces beyond their control, carrying themselves with dignity even when their roles were defined by others. In the larger narrative, these experiences underscore how thoroughly personal lives were shaped by economic motives. Yet they also highlight the resilience of communities who preserved their identity through connection, compassion, and the enduring belief that every person possessed a value far greater than anything written in a ledger. As the narrative continues through the intertwined realities of control, record keeping, disrupted families, and the emotional landscapes shaped by decisions made far beyond the influence of those who lived with their consequences, another thread emerges, one that affected every stage of daily life and revealed how deeply physical well-being was tied to systems of power. While ledgers charted births and futures, and forced movement reshaped family bonds, the most immediate conditions people navigated each day often came from the food they were given and the demanding routines they were required to maintain. Within many communities, nourishment was not simply limited but carefully regulated, shaping strength, energy, and even the health of those who carried the promise of future generations. This created an environment where people navigated their responsibilities under conditions that challenged both body and spirit, and where resilience became not just an emotional necessity, but a physical one. For women expecting children, these challenges took on a particularly heavy weight. They continued to work long hours, contributing to the routines that structured life across the estates. Even as their bodies required care and rest, their families watched them with quiet concern, offering what support they could through small gestures, sharing a portion of their own food, stepping in to help when possible, or sitting with them in the evenings to ensure they were not navigating their experiences alone. These moments of care revealed the deep bonds within the community, showing how people found ways to protect one another even when the broader environment placed limits on their comfort and choices. Despite the demanding conditions, individuals developed strategies to sustain themselves. Elders shared knowledge passed down through generations, how to make the most of what they had, how to preserve strength during long days, and how to support one another when someone's health wavered. Families created small rituals around meals, no matter how modest, recognizing that shared nourishment could foster a sense of unity even when food itself was scarce. These rituals became symbols of hope and connection, reminders that identity and community could remain intact despite the circumstances surrounding them. The long days of labor, coupled with limited nourishment, etched themselves into the memories of those who lived through them. People later spoke of the way they worked together, leaning on one another during the most demanding seasons, finding comfort in shared determination. They recalled the importance of resting moments, of songs softly after dusk, of the presence of elders who offered calming words when exhaustion became overwhelming. These memories formed an emotional foundation that helped individuals endure and helped later generations understand not just the hardships endured, but also the strength that carried their families forward. For the men, women, and children navigating these conditions, resilience became woven into the fabric of their identity. They adapted their routines, created networks of mutual care, and relied on one another to maintain a sense of balance. Their ability to endure became a quiet testament to the power of community, proof that even in environments where resources were restricted, people could cultivate meaning, connection, and purpose. When the story is viewed through the lens of time, these experiences reveal how profoundly life was shaped by systems that managed both physical and emotional landscapes. They show a world where people were defined by forces they did not choose, yet still found ways to assert their humanity through connection, compassion, and the determination to protect one another. This part of the narrative reinforces the broader story of endurance that weaves through each chapter, illustrating how individuals and families held on to hope despite conditions designed to test their limits, and how their strength became an enduring legacy shared across generations. As the story reaches its final chapter, the pieces of this hidden history come together to form a picture that is both complex and deeply human. Across decades defined by control, record-keeping, generational pressures, and the reshaping of family bonds, some estates operated with a singular purpose: expanding their population through forced reproduction. These places were driven not by fields or harvests, but by the belief that children's future labor could be planned, counted, and sold long before they took their first steps. And men and women were matched according to calculations that ignored the relationships they valued, the families they hoped to build, and the futures they imagined for themselves. The emotional landscapes of these communities were shaped not only by the demands placed on their bodies, but by the constant negotiation of dignity in a world that tried to define them by numbers and outcomes. Yet even in the midst of these pressures, people found ways to hold on to themselves. They shared wisdom across generations, protected one another through small acts of care, and built emotional networks stronger than the systems surrounding them. Families formed bonds that refused to be erased, carrying stories that resisted the silence later imposed by public memory. These quiet truths reveal a strength that official narratives often overlooked, a strength rooted in the determination to preserve identity, culture, and connection in circumstances designed to limit all three. And while the ledgers and records kept by those in power reduced lives to statistics, the communities living within those pages preserved meaning through shared memory, songs, and the unspoken understanding that their lives held value far beyond the roles assigned to them. In looking back at these events, it becomes clear that this chapter of history was not simply about strategies or systems. It was about the people who endured them and the legacies they created through resilience, unity, and the refusal to let their stories disappear. Their experiences shaped families across generations and continue to inform how we understand the past, reminding us that true history lives not only in documents but in the memories handed down with care and respect. By acknowledging these stories, we honor the strength of those who came before and ensure that their lives are remembered with the depth and dignity they deserve. Thank you for listening to this journey into a part of history often overlooked but deeply important. If you believe these stories matter and should continue to be shared, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these narratives alive and ensures that more people can learn, reflect, and understand the complexities of the past with clarity and compassion.